right, thank you very much. I'm really blessed to have a good group that's ready to hear some of this, because I've shared this a lot of places, and you get to a certain point and you know that you've pulled the wineskin to the point of breaking, and you guys are much more ready to carry this. It may still stretch you, but it seems like I'm connecting dots that have kind of been there floating. Like, are we in the kingdom? Are we in the church? Are we in the new covenant? Was Jesus in the new covenant? Was the early church in the new covenant? Are we in the old covenant still? All that stuff. We have to get to the point of understanding where the transitions are taking place. That when the king shows up, he brings the king's domain, the kingdom. The kingdom came with the king in the manger, and he began to establish it. And in Matthew 13, he says it started as a seed, it'll grow into a bush. Then it's going to turn into a tree. See, mustard seeds don't turn into trees, they turn into bushes. He says the kingdom is that crazy that it starts as a tiny seed, it grows to a bush. Then it turns into a tree. Then it becomes a giant tree, and birds are able to come and nest in it. This is a wild kingdom. This is the rock cut without hands that crashes into the feet, grows until it's a mountain that fills the entire earth. And a lot of people have been so negative and pessimistic about the church for so long, thinking that we're going down, we're not doing well, we're so polluted, all these concepts, when in reality, you're dealing with a church that's been growing for 2,000 years. We're not perfect, we're not there yet, but 1 in 3 of the world's population claim that Jesus is Lord. They bow their knee to Jesus as the Son of God, resurrected, died for our sins. Jesus is Lord. We may disagree on every other point of doctrine with our brother and sister, but they are a part of the family. They may be dysfunctional, but that doesn't make them not a family member. Like your natural family, you may have dysfunction, but you're still related. And so often we've been so looking for these concepts that people get into this area where they say, well, we're the remnant, meaning I'm the good part of the body of Christ and everybody else is the messed up part. I'm a part of the bride. I'm the true body. I'm the remnant. And these alienating terms come from a heart that doesn't understand the culture of honor that allows for differences. In Israel, everybody was Israel, but there were 12 tribes, and each tribe had their own strength and their own weakness. And as you start looking at how Joseph blessed his sons and how Jacob blessed his sons, you start to see how the nature of the different tribes had a different nature to each one, a strength and a weakness. Same is true in our denominations. Some may be really good at memorizing scripture, may be really good at the supernatural, may be really good at worship, and there are different aspects that we're strong and aspects where we're weak, but altogether we're the body. And when we look at the unity of the faith, right now there's over 33,000 Christian denominations. We're not going to get to a one-world denomination. That's not even the goal. That's not the unity of the faith. The unity of the faith is that we honor and love and respect and walk as family together, no matter what group we're a part of. And we can say, I sprinkle and you dunk. Well, that's okay. You drink Welch's and we get out the good stuff. Well, that's okay. When you all bring it together, though, we all say that Jesus is Lord and we bow our knee to him. Well, that makes us a part of the same family. That's the basis of our family. So we have to understand that we are doing better than ever before. The word says we move from glory to glory. It never says we stop and then recede. That means currently we have more glory than any church ever before us on the face of the earth. A lot of people not only want to idolize the Old Testament, they also want to idolize the early church. You remember the early church where Peter was a racist? And Paul had to rebuke him to his face because he was acting differently in front of different groups because of racist fears in his heart. We idolize the early church where Paul is writing to the Corinthians saying, your boasting is not good, because they're boasting about having a guy in their church who's sleeping with his stepmother. And he's like, hello, I know he's in your church. Your boasting is not good. You need to hand him over to Satan to deal with him, to get him out until he repents, and then you can bring him back in. The early church was not the idol of perfection that a lot of people want it to be. They want to put it on a pedestal as if that was what we need to go back to. And then they get these foolish ideas. They say, well, the early church must have been socialist because they all sold their houses and held everything in common. No, they weren't socialists. They just knew Jesus told us he's about to destroy Jerusalem. They are smart Jews. Sell your property if your house is about to be burnt down. Think about it. They sold their homes and put the money in a pot together and considered what to do with it because their city's about to be destroyed. Brilliant. Brilliant real estate move. A comet is about to hit Nashville. Sell your house for the best you can and get out of town before people hear about the comet that's coming. That's what they did. So they sold their houses, and they held everything in common, yet they met from house to house. That's the next verse in the book of Acts. They sold their houses, held everything in common, and they met from house to house. Did they all sell their houses? No. They just sold the extra. They sold the extra because they're still meeting from house to house. We've gotten so many confused ideas because people pull one little piece out, having no understanding of the larger context of history and culture and what was going on, to go, you know what, they weren't selling their houses just because they were moved on by so much love. That was an aspect as well, but also because they were wise. They also didn't sell every house because they still met from house to house. It wasn't that every house, even some people don't like the fact of ministry schools or even how we meet in churches. They think we should only meet in home groups. Well, we got a problem there because they also met on Solomon's portico, and that was a public meeting that they were all a part of. So they had public meetings. Also, Paul rented he rented property from Tyrannus, and he had a school every afternoon where he trained people in Ephesus. He had a ministry training school. He had a revival school in the first century. This is not a new concept. We're just getting back to it. So we can't idolize the early church, but we also need to keep things in proper context. So if you don't, you end up spinning off into like a legalism movement, or you spin off into a home church only movement, and you end up in all these different things. And I believe there are pieces that we can learn from stuff. It's great when you meet from house to house, absolutely, but it's not the only way. And it's not the way that some have taken it as that's the only way, and if we get back to it, then we'll have the results. That's not the point. That's not the point. And it's not, people are searching through the book of Acts to create their, formulas for revival and 10 keys for how God will finally show up. And if you do this, then you can manipulate him to show up, and you can twist his arm and he'll come down from his planet and he'll visit you. And we do it, and other groups do it, and that is not the point of what we learned from the New Testament. We learned that they made mistakes too. They misunderstood stuff, they had issues, and they worked through them. And we still have them, and we still work through them. I'm just want to emphasize to you, we can't idolize the early church. And we have to keep things in proper context to understand what was going on. Is that helpful? Amen. All right. And we were in Daniel 2 earlier. I was going to go somewhere else, but I feel like you guys are so ready for some more depth that we're going to just stay on this vein a little further. Does that sound good? All right. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9. I want to hit something over there together. I heard that other than Eric, I'm the only other person that's used this whiteboard this year, and so I'm glad it's here. And I'm even noticing how you have markers that you don't have to take the cap off because you don't have a headset, so you can do the one-handed marker opener. Brilliant. Yes. the difference between, you can always tell a teacher versus a preacher. Preachers like handhelds, teachers like headsets. Those are the difference usually. It's a big sign. So, okay, we're going to do a timeline together. You can draw yours straight if you'd like. This was a low point in history. Okay, what we have in Daniel chapter 9, he's having a vision. This is a well-known vision. It's called Daniel's 70 weeks. I'm going to share with you what everybody agrees on, and then I'm going to show you a piece that you may have not heard before. That everybody agrees on, that Daniel is having a vision. In this vision, the Lord is showing him some things that are to come. And he gives him this number, 70 times 7. And that adds up to 490 years. Now, the way that a lot of people teach it is they break up the time period, because the way the vision is explained to him is that there's 62 weeks, then there's 7 weeks, and then there's 1 week. And so you end up with your 70 weeks of Daniel broken into those divisions. So let's just read it together, and I'll show you what we find here. Verse 24, Daniel chapter 9. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets in a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler will come and will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And the temple he will set up abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out. Okay, this has been taught in a lot of ways, and whatever you've heard, just set it aside for a minute, and you can test it against that in a few, okay? But what we see in the first verse, 77s are decreed for your people and your city to finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision, the prophecy, and anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes. Okay? So, from the time that the edict is sent out to restore and rebuild, that occurred under Ezra and Nehemiah under the rulership of King Artaxerxes in 457 BC. That is going to be put right here on our timeline, 457 BC. Now here is Daniel having his vision in Daniel 9, okay? So here he is, he's sitting there, he's having the vision, and the Lord says, 70 times 7 has been decreed for your people to do this, but it won't begin until the edict goes forth. So he's saying it's not from the day you have the vision that 490 years begins. It's from the day that the edict goes forth, which went forth in 457 BC. So he tells him the time of the whole prophecy. Then he tells him the timing of when the prophecy will begin, which is 457 BC. Following me so far? Okay, as we saw before, Jesus was born in 3 BC, and his ministry started in 27 AD at 30 years old. Then he was crucified in 30 AD. So let's just add a couple things to our timeline. We're going to put 3 BC, and we're going to put that's Jesus' arrival. So you have Jesus' arrival. Then you have his ministry, which is 27 AD, and that is his beginning of his ministry. So we'll say min begins. And then you have 30 AD. And 30 AD is when he's crucified. We'll just put the cross here for sake of space. And we're going to put 433 AD, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So here's what you have going on. 490 years. He says, you have 490 years of prophecy that's about to take place. It'll start here when the edict goes forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Then he says, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So from this time until the anointed one comes, there will be 69 of the 70 weeks. That means from 457 BC until 27 AD, there will be 69 of the 70 weeks. That's 483 years out of the 490. Did I lose anyone yet? Okay. He gets the prophecy that says there will be 490 years. He says 490 years will start here at 457 BC. That as you're going through the time clock of 490 years, when you hit the 483 mark, the anointed one, the ruler, will come. 27 AD is 483 years after the edict is sent out. The anointed one, Jesus, shows up, and you have had so far from here to here 69 weeks, and you've had 483 of the years. Yeah, it's prophetic language. Everybody agrees, it doesn't matter what your background is, that when it says weeks, those are actually years. So 490 weeks would be 490 years. It's throughout the Old Testament, there's a prophetic language that's used. There are different times that you see things like sun, moon, and stars is representative of government. When Joseph has a dream and the sun, the moon, the stars bow down to him, and he's saying, in this dream, the Lord's showing him, everybody will bow down to you. You're going to be in a governmental position. There are certain thematic things that you find over and over through the Old Testament as prophetic language. So that's why each time God would bring destruction, whether under the Babylonians, or he also destroyed Egypt, or he destroyed Edom, he talks about the sun, the moon, the stars falling from the sky. He says it throughout Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalms. That was always Old Testament prophetic language for God coming in judgment to destroy a government or a city or a region. That's destruction. That's what he's declaring. So when you see this time period, these 483 years, that brings you right up to the beginning of his ministry, and the anointed one, the ruler, has come. So you have a total of 490 years that they have to put away sin, bring in everlasting righteousness, atone for wickedness. That's the first. There's 6 things here in verse 24. They have 490 years to get your act together, Israel. Now keep in mind that Daniel is living in captivity. They've been taken by the Babylonians. Before they were taken by the Babylonians, Jeremiah prophesied, you're going to be captive for 70 years because of your wickedness, and they're taken into captivity. And Daniel is sitting there reading these scrolls, and the Lord begins to speak to him about the next thing that's going to happen. Not only is he going to restore Israel back to their nation after the Babylonian captivity, but also God is putting a time clock that says from the time I restore you, you have 490 years to get your act together, because a new covenant is coming. And you need to straighten up and become and bring in everlasting righteousness, become a part of this new thing. So this is decreed for your people, your holy city, finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for your wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy place. You have 490 years, Israelites, to get it together. Time of mercy extended to them. Know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem in 457 AD under the edict from Artaxerxes until Jesus, the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 69 of the 70 weeks, 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It, referring to Jerusalem, will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death, and some translations say it better, and will be cut off. Did some of yours say, and cut off? I know mine says, and will have nothing. At that time, we know that Jesus was put to death. Also, he was cut off, because even though he ministered for 3.5 years, there was a moment where he's standing before the high priest, and in that moment, the high priest rejected him. You remember this? And he cuts him off. Rather than him being another religious leader in the area that they just are bothered with, he cuts him off and says he is a false king, he's a false Messiah, and he sends him over to be crucified. That's when he was cut off. He had nothing. He was cut off from his people by the religious rulers. And from there, they called judgment even on their own head. Let it rest, let his blood be on our head and on our children's heads. So he will be put to death and will have nothing. Now, the way that prophetic language works, it can seem a little choppy sometimes. So I'm laying out the chronology. There's a moment here where it slips into something else, and I'll explain what's going on. But the chronology picks up again in verse 27. So in the end of verse 26, the people of the ruler who will come. This is not the capital Anointed One ruler. This is the ruler who will come. Do you guys see that? You might need to underline that. In verse 26, after the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. So Jesus is put to death, will have nothing. Now, the people of the ruler who will come. Underline, that is someone else. The ruler who will come, and his people who will come. That is a different individual than the one who just got killed in the previous sentence. Do you see the division? Nod at me, something. Okay, thank you. There's a division. One just got killed. The other one is going to come. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Desolations have been decreed. By who? Jesus. We read it in the end of Matthew 23. He said, your city has been left to you desolate. And then he lays out how it's about to be destroyed, stone upon stone. Everything's about to be destroyed here. And an end of the age is about to happen to them. And he says, desolations have been decreed. War will continue until the end. That's the end of the Mosaic covenant, the end of Jerusalem, the end of the priesthood, the end of the Levitical system, the end of the temple, the end of everything in their world. As Jews, their whole world is about to collapse on them. Everything is about to be destroyed. And he is saying the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. That ruler is General Titus. His people is the Roman armies. That's the people and what he's declaring that's about to come. We actually can see this when you look in Matthew 24. Jesus refers back to Daniel. I'll just read it to you because you're familiar with it. He says in Matthew 24, verse 15, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. He's talking to first century Christians, giving them a warning here. And he says this is about to happen. Remember Daniel 9? What it said in Daniel 9? The destruction, the people of the ruler to come will destroy the city. That's what I'm talking about. And when you see it, verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go get anything out of their house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or in the Sabbath, for then there will be a great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Several interesting pieces here. One, if you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. Well, this is not talking about the end of the world, because I don't live in Judea. I don't need to fly to Judea and then run to the mountains. He's talking about a local, historical context. Pray that it's not in the winter. Pray that it's not on the Sabbath. Sabbath doesn't matter anymore. So that doesn't make sense. But in the first century, every Christian, and I'm not exaggerating, every single Christian in the first century understood Matthew 24 is talking about a coming destruction of Jerusalem. Every single Christian understood that because the historians record that out of 1.1 million Jews that were slaughtered, not one Christian died. Not one Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem, according to Tacitus, Eusebius, and Josephus, because they understood the words that Jesus declared to them in Matthew 24 were about to happen within 40 years, within a generation. They were on the lookout. That's why I keep saying, keep watch. I'll come like a thief in the night with my destruction. He's coming with destruction on Jerusalem as a thief in the night. They're keeping watch. And when they saw the abomination that causes desolation, which at that time was the Roman armies, you learn that in Luke chapter 21. Some of you guys are going tilt, and that's... I know, I brought this to the south. This is dangerous. Okay, Luke chapter 21, verse 20 says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the countryside not enter the city, for this is the time of vengeance in fulfillment of all that has been written. Here's what's going on. It's Judea, it's first century, and you see Roman armies show up around your city. Your natural inclination is run into the giant fortress over here called Jerusalem. Jesus tells you to do what is counterintuitive. Run and hide in the caves in the hills. Do not go into the fortress behind you. If you're in the field, run. Don't even go get your cloak. If you're on the rooftop, don't go down. There's a first century context. How often are you just chilling on your rooftop and you're like, oh, Roman armies? That's a first century context. People literally ran across their roofs across the city to get out. And you don't flee a city when you see an impending army coming toward you to run across the field and try to get into the mountains. You enclose in the fortress. Jesus tells them to do what is counterintuitive. And he's saying you need to get out of here as soon as you see the abomination which causes desolation. And in Luke 21, the parallel, he tells you exactly what it is that Daniel 9 was referring to. When you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, they are going to cause desolation. Run. Tells you exactly what the abomination of desolation is. It's the Roman armies coming to destroy the Jewish world, completely collapsing everything that they understood of their interaction with God. It just completely about to fall apart. And that is the desolation that's about to occur. So he tells them, you got to run. He also says in chapter 21 of Luke, verse 22, for this is the days of vengeance and the fulfillment of all that has been written. This is amazing because he's referring back to in Luke 4, Jesus got up, he pulls out this scroll at the temple, and he begins to speak. And he says, the Lord has anointed me too. And he lists off this whole mandate of his ministry. He's quoting from Isaiah 61. Several things have happened. One, Jesus has just picked up the scroll and flipped to a place. Now that's unusual. You normally read what was about to be read the next week. It picked up where you left off. So one, he's already flipped their lid because they're like, he flipped through the scroll and just picked something. That's crazy. We don't do that. We do verse by verse in this temple. And so he did that. But they also are stunned because he closed the scroll, he went and sat down, and it says, and they were amazed because he didn't finish the verse in Isaiah 61. When he quotes it in Luke 4, he says, and to declare the favorable day of the Lord, and he sits down. But when you finish it, Isaiah 61, the rest of the sentence that he stopped in the middle of, as in to declare the days of the vengeance of our God. And he didn't read that in Luke 4. He stopped with favor. And for 3.5 years, Israel had favor as their Messiah was there giving them favor and favor and favor and favor. And they reject and reject and reject. And he says, and the day of the vengeance of our God. Luke 21:22. He declares now the finishment of his job of Luke 4, of Isaiah 61, is now being declared. Now the smackdown is coming. You've had 3.5 years. I've been here. You rejected me. I'm finishing my ministry mandate and declaring desecrations and desolations have been decreed. The end of Jerusalem is coming now on you. They had 490 years to get it straight, according to Daniel 9. You remember Peter comes to Jesus and he says, how much should I have to forgive my brother? 7 times in a day? And Jesus says 70 times 7. Sound familiar? He's not saying forgive your brother infinitely. He's saying you should be as merciful and forgiving as God, who gave this nation 490 years to get it straight. He's not saying you're meant to have some, infinite number. Well, just make it 70 times 7. It wasn't arbitrary. He knew he was saying something to a people who knew the Old Testament. The problem with people's eschatology now is they don't know the Old Testament at all. And so people pick and choose through stuff. They attach it to the book of Revelation. They make a fun movie. They put Mike Seaver from Growing Pains in it. And they make bank on it. But he's talking to first century people who understood what he's saying. So when he says, Peter, you should forgive 70 times 7, Peter's going, oh, I should be as forgiving as God, who's given us 490 years. These things really go together. The Bible is super cool, guys. I'll just sum it up that way. People of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Daniel 9. And the end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He, jumping back to our hero from earlier who just got put to death, jumping back to him, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Okay, Jesus confirms a covenant with many. When did he do that? Not a trick question. Does anybody know when Jesus confirmed a covenant with many? Before his resurrection? At the Last Supper. Yes. At the Last Supper, he confirms a new covenant. And it's this same wording, the exact same wording that it says here in the verse 27, Daniel 9:27, he will confirm a covenant with many. When he gets up, he says, this is the blood of my new covenant shed for many. To confirm a new covenant. He sheds his blood. He shares that. I'm about to confirm a new covenant. It's in the middle of the 7. He will be put an end to sacrifice and offering. So remember with us here, we have from the edict until he begins his ministry, 483 years. That leaves us with another 7 years left over to finish out 490. So we're just going to put here we have 7 years. And right in the middle of it, he is put to death in the middle of the 7 years. And he puts an end to sacrifice at the cross. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. So he confirms the covenant because remember, from here, from 457 BC until 27 AD, God's not saying very much. That's a long time for God to be pretty silent with this nation. And so by the time Jesus shows up, and they are pretty much an atheistic nation at this point, who's like, God doesn't ever say anything or do anything, he confirms it's time. When he shows up in Luke 4 and says, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to, he is confirming, I'm here, and the 7 years of the last of this prophecy are about to start. I'm here to bring mercy and grace and favor. And for 3.5 years, he brings it and is rejected. Then he declares the last verse of Luke 4, the day of the vengeance of our God is now being released on you. And he declares what's going to happen out here in the future in 70 AD. And we need to understand the last 3.5 years of this 490-year prophecy, okay? 3.5 years after this prophecy, that the end of this prophecy, the last 3.5 years, is from after Jesus dies and is resurrected and ascends into heaven. There's a 3.5-year window. In that window of time, the church is growing and increasing. And at the 3.5-year mark, after Jesus' ascension, is when Stephen is stoned to death. Huge event that a lot of us haven't realized the significance, because Stephen is standing before the Sanhedrin and they're judging whether he's a heretic who should be killed or whether they can let him go. They've given problems to other people. They've already tried to whip and beat Peter and send them away in Acts 4, and they've been persecuting, but they haven't martyred anybody. At the 490-year mark, 3.5 years after the ascension, he's standing there and he says, I see heaven open. I see Jesus, the Son of Man, at the right hand of the Father. And they begin to declare that he's a heretic, a blasphemer. They officially, the whole Jewish Pharisaical government at that point, now makes an official rejection of Christianity and takes him out and stones to death the first martyr. That is the Jewish nation completely rejecting Christianity 3.5 years after. They have been told, you're going to have 490 years to end your sinful ways, to turn to me, to bring in everlasting righteousness, which is Jesus, your Messiah, to bring him in, to anoint the most holy. And as you look at the wording in the original, it's not the most holy place, it's the most holy one. It's to receive the anointed one, the ruler, as your Messiah. You have 490 years to do it. And when they finally get to the end of 490 years and they have Stephen standing in front of them, they reject him, stone him to death, and it becomes a division where now the chief priests, the Pharisees, they send out Saul to persecute the early church, and they spend the next about 40 years attacking the Christian church of the first century. It was the Jews that were persecuting the Christian church of the first century before they got destroyed by Rome. The Jewish persecution takes place at that point, and that was what was decreed here. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. At the temple will be set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out. That was the destruction that came when the abomination, the armies that surrounded Jerusalem, and Jesus told us exactly what that was. The Christians knew, and they fled, and they left the city, and they moved out to the mountains in Pella nearby. And it's just incredible what took place over the next time period there. This is a major change for maybe some of you, the way that you may have read Daniel 9 in the past. What I'm presenting to you is the standard historical perspective of this passage. When you look it up in any commentary that's older than the 1800s, all of them would agree with what I just shared with you. Matthew Henry commentary, one that we probably know from any internet research you've done. Matthew Henry is very well known, very well respected theologian and commentator. He says that Daniel chapter 9 is the most illustrious, amazing prophecy of Jesus in the entire Old Testament. Some have taken this And they pick this thing up and they go, well, this brought us to Jesus' ministry, but because we don't live in the kingdom, we just live in the church age, the kingdom is thrown off way into our future. The kingdom will be after the rapture, and they've confused the millennium with the kingdom. They made them the same thing. They throw it way off into the future, and they go, oh yeah, and it's going to be the Antichrist that makes a covenant for many for 7 years. He'll be the one that makes a covenant for many. And halfway through it, he'll be the one that breaks the covenant. And they take this 7-year period, and they throw it out here 2,000 years in the future. That's what some have done. When you hear about this concept of a 7-year period in the future, this is the only place that you find that. There is no 7-year period. If you want to do your own study, please do. Be Bereans, go do some research. There is not one 7-year period mentioned in the book of Revelation. Exactly. People have picked that up and said there's a 7-year tribulation coming in the future under the Antichrist from Daniel 9, and they chuck it way out here in our future because they don't see what Jesus did in these 7 years as being him. But the church has seen it in the past. That's why the commentators said this is the most amazing prophecy of Jesus. This prophecy tells us 5 major keys. One, it tells us exactly when he'll arrive. It says this many years will go by and the anointed one will come. It tells us the exact year of his arrival. It was easy for the Magi to check and go, oh, it's right there. It tells us exactly when he's going to start his ministry. Here's when he arrives. This is when he starts. And then you start looking at the rest of the time and you go, it tells us when he arrives. It tells us when he dies. Exactly when he dies. It also tells us that there will be a removal of the old covenant, that the animal sacrifice will be put to an end. That's the removal of the old covenant. It also tells us he'll confirm a new covenant. That's the new covenant being established. And it also tells us of the destruction of Jerusalem that's about to take place. Daniel chapter 9 tells you 5 major time keys of what's happening. It tells you Jesus' ministry starting. It tells you when he will die. It tells you the old covenant will be removed. It tells you the new covenant will be established. And it tells you that Jerusalem will be destroyed. All in 6 verses. One amazing prophecy right there. I know I've probably already hit you with so much, and I know it's 4:30 right now. I wanna pray over you guys. I do want to do some impartation. I feel like there's so many loose ends, because obviously we could do Q&A for like 4 hours now, and I can't go there, just time limitations and such. So what I do want you to consider is whenever you're hearing these passages, like it says in the day of those kings in Daniel 2, and it talks about the Lord has shown the king things that will happen in the future. Just because it says things that will happen in the future doesn't mean our future. It means future at the time it was written. We have to understand, because you can't just take a verse like says, today, this day, a virgin has conceived and will bear a child. We can't take that as a present prophecy for our future. It had a fulfillment. It occurred. It didn't have a double fulfillment. It didn't have a multiple fulfillment. It had a fulfillment. Prophecy has a fulfillment. If you think it has a double fulfillment, it means you misunderstood one of the two. Prophecy has a fulfillment. And even in what he says in Matthew chapter 24, he says this will be the worst thing that's ever happened, and it'll be the worst thing, and nothing like it will ever happen again. Well, think about that. If it's at the end of time, how could anything like it ever happen again? It's in the middle of human history. It's stuck right in the middle because it's the worst that ever happened, and nothing like it will ever occur again. talking to the Jewish people about what's about to happen. Their whole world is about to collapse. They've had thousands of years of walking with God, with a temple, with animal sacrifice, Levitical system, our holy land. They've built their place. And God says, your whole world is about to collapse. It'll be the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and nothing like it will ever occur again. It's a pretty clear statement. And yet a lot of people go, well, 70 AD was just a foreshadowing of what God's going to do in the future. Not if Jesus is telling the truth. Because he says it's going to happen within 40 years, within a generation, be the worst thing that ever happened, and nothing like it will ever occur again. And I know for us, we go, well, what about the Holocaust? Holocaust was terrible. But when you start reading the history of what took place in 70 AD, it's gruesome. It's hard to even verbalize some of the things that were taking place. There was a man, Josephus calls him the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness. Paul calls him that too in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And Josephus refers to him as that. His name was John Levi. And in the first century, he came in and he said, I am God. And he set up his throne inside the Jewish temple. And he told people with lying signs and wonders that I am going to free us from the Roman armies that are coming to destroy us. As a sign of your good faith, burn the storage of food. So they burned all their food and storage. Rome just walked up and said, we're just going to enclose you now for 4 months. By the time the Romans walked in to kill the Jews, at the time that they busted down the door 4 months later, they could not put their foot on the ground because of the amount of dead bodies inside Jerusalem. Every rooftop was a stack of dead bodies. Every road, they couldn't walk without stepping body to body. They could not touch the ground. There was famine, there was plague, the 4 horsemen that we hear about in Revelation, plague, war, famine, those things ripped through Jerusalem before the Romans even got there. Titus, they bust the door down, and Josephus recorded him weeping for what he saw when they busted the door down. They didn't have to even come in and really kill people as much as they burned the city down, because it was just bodies everywhere. This is an unbelievable thing that happened in the first century, and we as Christians have not heard about this event at all, for the most part. Unless you go to a really good seminary, you're not going to hear about a lot of this stuff. And it's recorded, it's public. You can go and read the works of Josephus and Tacitus and Eusebius and read about this stuff. And this is a huge part of our Christianity that we have to understand. Daniel 9 even prophesies. We understand the day that Jesus started his ministry, the day that he was put to death, the removal of the old covenant, the establishment of the new. But the 5th piece of Daniel chapter 9 occurred, and we have not even heard about it for the most part. This is important stuff, and I just want to lay that out there as we're looking at Old Covenant, New Covenant, and what occurred in our history. This was the removal, because Hebrews 8 says outdated and obsolete will soon fade away. That's when God removed it. Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for allowing so much freedom in your house for me to be able to share things that are very controversial that many of us have never heard before. I just wanted to say I honor and I really appreciate you for that. The fear is a huge piece of this, and there's 2 things. One, fear sells. I mean, CNN, 24-hour news network, it works. You get Hale Lindsey sold 35 million copies of the late great Planet Earth. In the Left Behind series, they sold 65 million copies. Harold Camping, when he prophesied the rapture 2 years ago, he made in the year leading up to his fake rapture $100 million. When Edgar Vincent when he wrote his book, 88 Reasons That Jesus Will Return in 1988, he sold 4.5 million copies. That's appalling. I'm like, how many stupid Christians are there? 4.5 million copies sold, and we know nobody knows the day or the hour. And he writes a book that says it's going to be this year. 1988, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988. Sold 4.5 million copies. He revised it. 89 Reasons for 1989. 91, 93, 95. His 95 edition sold 300,000 copies. It was still being sold. I haven't touched 300,000 copies, and I'm mad. Not because I want to sell that much or make that much, but because it's sick, the trash that people are buying in that quantity. They're just swallowing poison. Because the poison that they're swallowing says, well, we're just in the church age, not the kingdom. So we don't expect signs. We don't expect the supernatural. Everything Jesus said about the kingdom has no relevance to us. Let's just rip the book of Matthew out and throw it in the trash. Because that has nothing to do with us. We're in the church age, not the kingdom. We can take all the references to the kingdom, chuck it 2,000 years in our future and go, you know what, maybe I'll save a few souls on my way out. But we're just the church. We're a remnant. And we stink, and we're waiting for a rescue. That's not the message of the gospel. That's the message of dispensationalism. That's the message of a church that has abandoned the kingdom message to occupy until I come, and have instead become preoccupied with his coming. It is not our calling to keep watch any longer as an imminent return of any second, when in reality, the apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, and teacher, Ephesians 4 says, are here until we come to the full knowledge of the Son of God, the mature stature of the fullness of Christ, the unity of the faith. At 33,000 denominations, we are not at the unity of the faith right now. We're still too busy trying to kill each other theologically to be at the unity of the faith right now. The earth is sitting around groaning for us to get it and become the full sons that manifest the glorious freedom that the earth wants to be released into its freedom, and it won't get it till we get it. So we have to get it first for the earth to get anything, and it's like, come on. I'm going to have another earthquake. Help me out, sons of God. The earth is not shaking and quaking because it's the end of the world. It's shaking and quaking more and more because the church is rising up into who she is. When typhoons show up, it's not the judgment of God. It's time for someone like Heidi Baker to go out to the beach and go, typhoon, stop. And she does, and it does. And I think I saw a video of you doing that to a tornado on YouTube. Yeah, and he did it in Cleveland too. It's an understanding we have to grow into of our true identity, that we're not going anywhere. Somewhere is coming here. Heaven comes to earth. And it comes to earth more and more with our understanding of identity, bringing heaven down. We're here to do something. We're the apostolos to culturize this earth into something that God steps out and says, it feels like home. That's the ultimate where we're headed. There is not a keep watch, I'm coming as a thief in the night, all that stuff. They were keeping watch so that when they saw the armies surrounding Jerusalem, they would run to the hills. That was a first century warning for them to keep watch, because within a generation, this destruction is going to come. And they kept watch, and every single one of them saved their life because of it. And at this point, the signs of the time for us is kingdom advancement, unity of the faith, the bride becoming who she is, the identity rising up. Jesus, it does not honor him to marry down. He will not be unequally yoked. He is going to have a bride that can stand and look him eye to eye. He is going to have a bride of equal stature, of equal glory, of equal divinity nature. You're a partaker of divine nature. Let me put it to you this way. The Trinity is uncreated divinity. They always have existed. They're eternal. They always have been there. The bride is created divinity. He can only create after his own kind. And for him to put seed in and say, this is going to be one of my children, this is going to be a son of God, this is going to be part of my family, he can only create after his kind. Cats produce cats, dogs produce dogs. God Divinity produces divinity. You are created divinity when you step inside the bride. I'm not saying you are God to be worshipped, but you are created with a divinity in you, a sonship, that you're a part of the family, a bride that's equal, that's equally yoked. This identity message sows in through everything. I know you guys are hearing that. New covenant, this is all attached together. And for us to go, we're the sons of God. We're here to be supernatural, to be kingdom people, until we get raptured out and the Antichrist takes over and Jesus loses the planet and we stink. There's a massive contradiction in the charismatic church that has to die. We can't go back to old covenant. That doesn't help us. It's not about trying to just save some people. We're here to build, occupy until he comes. And as we do that, we take ground, we advance, we think long-term. A righteous man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And people who focus on fear and the end of the world don't leave an inheritance for their children's children. They max out their credit cards in hopes to get raptured before the bill comes. Honestly, that's what happened in 1988. 4.5 million people read his book, and most of the people that are in my parents' age group that bought into it went out and bought boats and cars and pools and houses and went on vacations and partied it up because the bill will not be here when I get raptured. People quit their jobs. They went completely bonkers. It was Y2K on steroids. It was Harold Camping on steroids because it was ahead of time. This is where TBN was having their rapture practice warnings that would come on TV. And they'd have alerts and they'd be like, practice for the rapture. And people were buying trampolines and bouncing in their house. Not kidding at all. Do you remember any of this, Jeff? Okay. You're not in that age group. Oh, he was busy. You were busy. That was 1988. Nope, not at that point. Okay. Well, okay, there's confusion over when we say, is there no rapture? I'm not saying there's no rapture. What I'm saying is, this 7-year period, Jesus completed it. There is a point where he comes and he takes all of us and he transforms us in the twinkling of an eye. At the end, that will occur. He will come and he'll catch us up. And part of that catching up, let's say you and I are in a foot race and I run 20 miles and you've only run 2. There's going to become a point where you run the other 18. And it says in 1 John that when we see him, we will be like him. You're transformed into his glory. We're moving toward it. And there's a certain point where then you'll be caught up to where he is. And we need to catch up. And we're working on catching up. And it's happening so much. I mean, since Azusa Street, the church is like doing incredible. And we've had this negative perspective sown through the church. But the last 100 years has been incredible. And there's just, I remember Lance Wallnow sharing this years ago. He said the Lord told him to listen to a cassette tape, and that he was going to tell him something about the end. And he's like, okay. So he starts listening. The cassette tape was boring as all get out. He falls asleep in his armchair. And then, you remember with cassette tapes, I'll talk to you. You remember cassette tapes. No, I'm teasing. Everybody remembers cassette tapes. Okay, so you get to the end, and it clicks, and then it rewinds. You remember that? And as it would rewind, because it starts as a big reel and it goes down to a small one, it would be like, and it would just keep doing that. Lance, he falls asleep. The cassette tape finishes. He hears the click, and then he hears it start to unravel. And as it unravels, it gets faster and faster and faster and faster until finally, boom, and it snaps at the end. And that, we remember that analogy from cassette tapes. And that's really, if you look at history, you have 1,500 years from the early church to Martin Luther. And then you get to a point where now Bibles can be read in your own language. Now salvation is restored to by faith rather than by putting money in the box to get people out of purgatory. And then it continues to grow. You have a first Great Awakening in the 1700s, a second Great Awakening in the 1800s, the 1900s, you jump into Azusa Street, and the acceleration is off the charts how fast we're moving now. And even just technology in the last 100 years, and medical, and everything that's happening in the earth, we've moved from the dun, 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 dun of the first 1,500 years to this last 500 years has just been insanity. And the last 100, even the last 50 has been absurd. The understanding of Martin Luther, he said the priesthood of all believers, it took like 400 years to go from him to actually people believing it, equipping the saints, empowering the saints, releasing the saints, having schools like this. This is, we're actually getting it. Martin Luther had a picture of it 500 years ago, and it took like 450 years for us to even get it. So we're in a tremendous time right now. I couldn't imagine being alive at any other time. I don't want to go back in any way. I'd love to be alive 100 years from now to see what's going on in the future, whether that's heaven actually has arrived on earth or we're so much further in our advancement. So that's my thought on your question of, is there a rapture? And that will probably have to be the only question that I can answer